Now, if you marked in your Bibles, underline that.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the If You Mark in Your Bible podcast. My name is Josh, your host, and today we are looking at Micah chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, and the title of our episode is The Most Discouraging Verse. Studying this with us today is Geoff Tucker, no stranger to the podcast. He's been on before, so I'd encourage you to go back to previous seasons, find the one he's on. I think we looked at Ezekiel, if I'm mistaken.
Yep.
So go check that out. That's a good study as well. But as we mentioned, the most discouraging verse, Geoff, if you had to choose which passage for this episode to describe the most discouraging verse, what would you have chosen?
Well, that's a good question. You know, my first thought was, would this be discouraging to me personally? Would it be a verse that's kind of discouraging maybe in general? And then the other was, maybe if you were to hear that, as in a verse, you know, where maybe the Lord is saying something that, because it's not being said to me, maybe it's not as discouraging to me now, but imagine how discouraging it would be to hear it then,
right,
or to be in that situation. And my first impulse was to go to John 15, verses 18 and 19, and the first half of 20, which I can read that real quick. In this passage, it says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a slave is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you." And the reason I chose this verse is not so much because the words themselves are so discouraging, as much as the living it is so discouraging. It is very hard as a Christian sometimes, especially in the early stages of your walk, to put enmity between you and the world, because this is where you are. And a lot of people get discouraged in their journey because of that. And so when we take on the name Christian, when we put Christ on in baptism, you know, we are stepping out of the world and into the light. But a lot of times that causes some real conflict, and it does discourage a lot of people. So that was my reasoning for picking it. You know, as a teacher, James 3:1 feels a little discouraging, you know, saying that not many of us choose to be teachers.
Right.
But I've spoke to a lot of people on that verse saying that, you know, I don't think that is meant to discourage us from wanting to teach as much as it's letting us know that it's something that we need to take serious and we need to put the time and effort in. And then, of course, there's multiple verses that, if I was in the moment at the time, would be very discouraging. You think back to Genesis, you know, and the flood and everything. So, but for me personally, I believe John 15.
That's good insight. Yeah. To those listening right now, put in the comments whatever you would what you would choose, the passage that you think would be considered the most discouraging as well. So just a brief context of Micah. Micah was written around the 8th century BC. His ministry took place during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. You had the Assyrian Empire, which was a threat against the nation of Israel at that time, social injustice as well as political instability in Israel, both the northern and southern kingdoms at this time. And in fact, the northern kingdom actually fell during Micah's ministry. So, excuse me, this was written either as they were about to fall or during, or not soon after it actually did fall into Assyrian captivity. So most of his audience has been morally compromised, which is obviously discouraging from a prophet standpoint, and we're going to see that. In fact, the reason I specifically chose this verse is because of this scenario. It looks as if there's no morality in God's people at this time. So you have anything to add to the context before we begin?
No, I love the context because, again, when we talk about Micah, we're talking about God's chosen people and the things that are being told to them. If I was in their shoes, in that situation, and hearing that, this would be very discouraging. And again, it goes back to that context of, how discouraging would it be to hear this coming to you, especially when it starts, "Woe is me."
Right, right. And that's what's interesting. Chapter 6 starts essentially a witness testimony against the people. And I'm glad you brought that up, because you say if you're sitting in that scenario, it would be discouraging to you. The people who actually sat in that position denied it.
Yeah.
Acted like it was no big deal, which I think shows just kind of, it's going to lend to essentially what we're going to talk about as far as this verse goes in the state of Israel.
It was an interesting time because his time as a prophet was Jotham, was a pretty good king, but he didn't tear down the high places.
Yeah.
And he should have torn down the high places. In fact, you go back to Exodus and God tells them, when you get to these places, that's exactly what you have to do. He was a good king, but he didn't do that. And then you have Ahaz comes in, and he's a terrible king and idolater, And then Hezekiah comes in, and he's a lot better. And now he has his faults. He got prideful and showed his treasures in his army, which led to captivity later on. But you see this leadership, and it goes back to what God had told Samuel. They've rejected me. And so you put all that together, and you see that Israel's kind of, like you said, going through this up and down time period. And during the time when idolatry was so bad, we always have to remember that God is a jealous God by his own admission, and that the condition that they were in, they just did not understand how serious it was to God.
Right.
And it's there's nothing like having your eyes open to that.
Yeah. No, that's definitely, and that's why minor prophets is so valid today.
Yes.
I mean, not that in the rest of the Bible's not, but it's not difficult to see the correlation between the people and their sin thousands of years ago versus the sin of the world today. It hadn't changed, and so the message still applies. So without further ado, we'll begin reading. I'd like to bring up our text. I want to remind everyone that our text is brought to us or powered by the Scattered Abroad Network, where you can catch this podcast and many like it. So I'd encourage you to check that out. There's also an app you can find on the App Store that you can download. It's a great resource to a ton of podcasts, archived sermons, and so forth. So very definitely recommend that as well. So without further ado, let's begin reading verse 1. It says, "Woe is me, for I've become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires." What do you have there, bud?
Well, first of all, I had highlighted the "woe is me" because, like I said, that when you start with "woe is me," you already know the direction this is going. You're not getting good news. But as he starts discussing the completely barren harvest that he's describing, he is not saying that there is some fruit. He is saying there is no fruit.
Yeah.
And for us as New Testament Christians, I always think about the fruits of the Spirit as described in Galatians 5. And you know what the fruits of the Spirit are, but you also know what the fruits of the wicked are. And he is telling them that they have none of these fruits. There is nothing to gather. So they are completely barren of anything redeemable at this point.
Great point. I actually underlined "woe was me." It's a prophetic lament. If you want cross references, you could put Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 5. Elijah also makes that same type of appeal in 1 Kings chapter 19. So we put that. But this is an idiom that "woe is me" is depressing in the English, but even as depressing as that is, it still doesn't capture the true essence of the Hebrew idiom. When this is said, from the Hebrew perspective, there is a communication that all hope is lost. There's hopelessness. There's no chance of positivity, and so that's why you see a lot of these prophets use this state. And it, I say that for this reason. Just keep that idea, that hopeless thread, as we go through these next few passages. That's where it's coming from. Is similar. I would say this is maybe even worse as far as from Micah's perspective than it was when Elijah said he was the only one who's faithful to God, and then God tells him there are 7,000 who haven't bowed or kissed the ring of Baal, and all that. I think Micah here is even more distraught than Elijah was in that instance, and so that's the idea behind this idiom. And I've also underlined that summer fruit has been gathered. Summer fruit's the final fruit. And again, it goes in line with that hopelessness of this passage from the standpoint of everything's been gathered. So when you harvest a crop, you harvest what you can sell, you harvest what you need. You keep the rest of it on the vine so it can continue to grow, and then when you run out of what you have, then you have something to go back to as well. So this thought of the summer fruit has been gone. It's the last of the last has been picked as well. In other words, because everything else is gone, there's nowhere that we can go to. You think about it from a farmer's standpoint, and particularly at that time, as your cover starts to get bare, it doesn't worry you as much because it just means you have to go out to the go out to the field and pull a fresh batch of food. But Micah's describing an instance where there's nothing. So once it's gone, which it has been, there's nothing to go pull from. What else you have?
Well, not much more than that. Like I'd said, it's just this idea that like you had said, the cupboard is bare. And the hopelessness of all of that should have struck a chord with these people. And really, it's not like that's even enough of a statement, because as we're going to see in 2 and 3, he doubles down on what all of this means. And it even gets, what looks more hopeless. But I just think it's a big deal to say nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, he's saying there is nothing. There is not a single. It is completely gone. That's a strong statement to me. Just in, we feel like, when times are bad, at least there's some hope. There's some good still. When I look around now, as I see things that are horrible, I can also look pretty close and find some things that are pretty wonderful. I can see the Lord's work being done. I can see good things happening. So, even when we've seen it be terrible and bad, there's still good things going on. And he's saying, look, there is nothing. And I'm sure we'll get into it as we discuss verses 2 and 3, but this is starting to sound very familiar to another time when there was nothing. There was no good on the world. And so the difference between in Genesis during the flood period and now, though, is, Genesis was the world at large, whereas this is God's chosen people. This is who God has chosen to carry out his plan, and they have gotten themselves into a state that there is absolutely nothing redeemable with them.
That's a great point you make, and that's I think that's significant, like you mentioned, and like I said, we'll talk about the flood in just a moment. But from this standpoint, the promise God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and then essentially to Isaac and Jacob, and then even David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that promise has already been made.
Yeah.
When the flood took place, that promise hadn't been made yet.
Yep.
And so excellent point there. Just to kind of build on what you talked about as far as the nothingness of this passage, the word gleaned, I underlined that. And I just put the antithesis to Leviticus 19, 9 and 10, and Deuteronomy 24, verses 19 through 21. And that's essentially when they were commanded, when they harvested the field, to leave the outer portions of the field alone so that the poor could come and pick, whether it was grapes or grain or whatever it was. But that's essentially how you fed the poor. The farmers would leave that outer portion of the field alone. Ruth is a great example of that when she went out to harvest.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about here. And I just put not even enough to cover the poor.
Yeah.
And that's the barrenness of righteousness. It's a metaphor, but that's how much righteousness is here. There's not even that little portion that the poor survives on. Everybody is morally corrupt. And we're going to see that from the top to the bottom.
Something else that, he's talking about the clusters of the grapes and the first ripe fig, which I crave. They have fruits. So maybe the cupboard's not bare. It's just not anything anybody wants.
Right.
This isn't the pleasing fruit that you're looking for. There is this awful, bitter fruit of this complete worldliness and idolatrous nation that
that's a good
should
point.
be focused on God. So
grapes and figs also are judgment themes throughout the Bible. So you can put Isaiah chapter 5 verses 1 through 7, Hosea chapter 9 and verse 10 as well. And just put this theme next to verse 1. We went from joy to judgment. That's what
Mm-hmm.
that. So this is not a. This is a current state of the physical, or I'm sorry, the moral nature of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's a little prophetic nature to it as well of the judgment that you're heading towards too. So let's move on to verse 2. It says, "The godly has perished from earth, and there is no upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net." What do you have there?
Well, first, I just highlighted the godly person has perished from the land. And again, these are pretty strong words for, the godly person is gone. And not just gone, but they are gone. They are dead and gone. All the good stuff has perished. Like we said, the sweet fruit that we crave, all these things that God is looking for, these are gone. And not just gone, they're dead. It is not like there is. I think of the vine, almost of how, there's not even a vine left to produce that anymore because of all the godly people perishing. So again, he is speaking very low of the current state. But then just the totality, he keeps using these, kind of absolute terms. I've circled how he says there is no upright person. All of them lie in wait and bloodshed, and each of them. So no, all, and each are all circled in my Bible, where I've just kind of looked at, man, these are no and all are very absolute. But not only that, but he's saying each of them. So, everyone that is there hunts the other with a net. So those three words really stood out to me.
Good point. Underline that word godly. Next to verse 2, let me say it like this. Next to verse 2, I just put this note, the absence of covenant loyalty. And that's twofold in this instance.
Mm-hmm.
You can underline that. That word godly is the Hebrew word hasid. It's, if you just want to define it, it's a covenant-keeping person.
Mm-hmm.
So godly is a great word to describe it, but this is a person who keeps the covenant. And one commentator made this point, which I really liked, and so I wrote it underneath this passage. The loss of hasid, so the loss of a godly covenant-keeping person, leads to the disintegration of the Hebrew word chesed. Chesed is one of those Hebrew words. It's like the Greek word agape, where it kind of, people know it, even though it's not part of the English language.
Mm-hmm.
Chesed is a difficult word to define. The best way I've heard, and we've mentioned this on this podcast before, but the best way I've heard it defined is the benefits that come with being in a covenant with God.
Yeah.
That's what the word chesed means. And so the point that this phrase, the godly has perished, or really this verse, is because there is a lack of godly covenant-keeping people, then the benefits of being in a covenantal relationship with God is starting to disintegrate.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes in line with that judgment that's about to come.
Yes.
You go to Deuteronomy, and you have the blessings and the curses, and God basically makes that point. As long as you are faithful, you will be blessed. You rebel, you'll be cursed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're in that point now where, Romans 11 verse 2, behold the goodness and severity of God,
Mm-hmm.
because there is no covenant-keeping person. Now the severity of God is going to be seen, and we know that. We look back at history. I would argue personally, for me, that this is probably written a shade before the Assyrian captivity,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the reaction of the people and so forth. So what else you have?
Well, and along those same lines, understanding the covenant relationship between us and God, or just people and God, whether it was under the Old Testament covenants and through the law and everything, or whether it's the covenant that we're under now through Christ, is how do we find ourselves outside of that covenant? It's never because God has broken his promise.
Right.
It is always because we have done something to remove ourselves from that covenant protection. That covenant is an agreement between us and God, and it was a covenant between them and God. And God told them everything they needed to know to stay within that covenant relationship,
Right.
to where they would be protected. He would fight on their side. He would lead them to where they were going, and they would have all these promises they were given. The problem is they didn't do, and like we had said when we go back to those kings, they didn't finish the process. And that is why we have the prophets in the Old Testament, is them pleading with Israel to understand the error they made when they came into a land and did not destroy the high places, when they did not destroy the idols, when they did not completely get all of that out of the land before settling in. And then how that gravitates into, well, now we have an issue, and well, now the people are getting drawn into idolatry. And then on top of the idolatry, you're starting to see the crumble of everything around them, to where they're losing sight of God because they're no longer seeing his promises. Well, why aren't you seeing his promises? Because you've broken your covenant with him. Right. You're no longer in that covenant with him because you chose to remove yourself by doing what he explicitly told you not to do. And so they're in this horrible situation for the simple fact of taking themselves out of that protected covenant relationship, not realizing how good they would have it. And being outside of that covenant relationship, they get this idea like they either don't understand what God is willing and able to do for them, or they feel like he has left and abandoned them, and they're turning somewhere else for help. But this is a common theme. We discussed Ezekiel, and on our last show that together, and that was one of the things that it's this problem with idolatry, and eventually God is going to take care of that problem. Right. And that's what a lot of this is prophesying towards. Like this, God is going to make sure that idolatry is no longer a problem.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up God taking care of it, because I've underlined they lie in wait, and that's that. The language there is expressed in the idea that this isn't just the people taking advantage of opportunities to sin as they present themselves, but there's more of that going out to seek the opportunity to sin. It's one thing to see a pile of cash in front of you and no one watching and taking it, versus actually going in and actually trying to steal the money, making a plan to steal the money. That's the state we're in now. Yeah. And I put Genesis 6 and verse 5 when it talks about right before the flood that evil was on the heart of man continually, and that's the thought here. It's not a good person who is tempted and in that moment of weakness takes advantage of that temptation, succumbs to that temptation, takes advantage of or participates in this sin. This is a person who is actively going out to looking to sin as well. And so again, verse 2 is probably the reason I would say that this was chosen as the most discouraging verse, because not only do you just have good people who are messing up, you just have a nation of wicked people who are finding pleasure and looking to fulfill a desire to do wickedness.
And what does this make you think of when you read there is no upright person among men? That's a pretty general statement. So you think, okay, well, this is, these are people who have misguided morals or something like that. But then as you continue, it says, they lie in wait for bloodshed, and they hunt the other with a net. These are selfish, self-seeking, throat-slitting people. They are doing whatever they can. They have no concern for others. They are only concerned with how they can get ahead and what they can do to, like I said, take someone else out so that they can capitalize off of it. Right. This is the most selfish, self-seeking mentality you could be in. Well, meanwhile, God has given them a nation to be strong, united under him. Right. And they've completely abandoned that. And now, what is the easiest way to take over a group of people? To divide them amongst themselves. Yeah. And these people are in that situation. Sounds to me like they are ready to be completely slaughtered and taken into captivity because they're not united in any way.
Well, underline upright and put Micah 2, 6, and 7. And there, I'll just read 6. Do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach for such a thing. Disgrace will not overtake us. And that goes back to what you're talking about. If you had heard this, you'd be discouraged about it. Micah is giving this message to them, and what they tell them, nothing's going to happen to us. Yeah. And so that's an indication. Verse 3, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and they are beyond ambitious. They have taken it to another level of ambition.
A great point.
Selfishly ambitious.
In fact, verse 3, it says their hands are one on, let me start over. Their hands are on what is evil to do it well, and the prince and the judge ask for a bribe, and the great man utters the evil desire of his soul. Thus they weave it together. What do you have there?
Well, so I'm using a New American Standard, 95, and it says, concerning evil, both hands do it well.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different wording than what you have, but either way, it's still that same idea of, they have both hands filled. They
Well,
are completely occupied with doing evil.
Yeah, and on top of that, so that Hebrew word, both hands, is a great translation. In fact, I think it's probably better than this one. The idea there is ambidextrous.
Yes.
They can do it with both hands, which is describing their skill at committing sin.
Yeah.
And
It takes practice to be
right,
good at both
and
hands.
Exactly. And you and I have, and I've had conversations with people where you look at someone who gets caught committing a crime.
Yeah.
And you see the intricacies and the level of intelligence and commitment and capability that goes into committing these crimes. And I've had conversations with people about those people and wondered, like, why didn't that person just use those tools and those talents to do something legal? Because they have the capability of doing so.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you have here. You have their heart is so set on wickedness and sin that that's what they're using their intellect, their capability, and their skills to do.
Yeah, that ability that they have is driven by their desire.
Right.
And because their desire is only on evil, they're only going to use those talents for evil.
Right.
Whereas when you look at them, you think, man, you could find just ways to use those talents and have as much or more. I mean, same with these people. If they would have just stayed with God, think how much more they would have had.
Right.
And that's the lie that we buy. That's something that I am really frustrated with, personally, as just living in today's times, is that we are so eager to buy the lies that people sell us. And because we're so willing to buy the lies, they're able to get things over on us. It's like, we should not sit in our seats and tolerate this, but we've bought this lie. And one of the lies that we buy is that if it doesn't make sense to us, then it won't work. And so we tend to go with our own desires. Well, this makes sense to me, it will work. When God has given you a clear path that is different than the path you're taking,
Right.
but you don't trust it, you don't believe that God's way could be better than yours just because in your experience you just don't see how that could be possible. Try it. Just try it.
Right.
Test that theory.
Oh, that's a great point, because I think that's where a lot of people, they just think it won't work, so they don't put it into practice at all.
How could loving your enemies ever benefit you? They're just going to get you more run over.
Right.
Well, try it.
Right. Great point. I'll underline that phrase also, weave it together. Systemic collaborative sin, and this goes back, the prince and the judge ask for a bribe. So these are individuals who are supposed to be upholding the law,
Yes.
Ensuring that everyone's treated fairly. Even they're corrupt, and this goes in line with what we talked about earlier, just wickedness from the top down. But I've also, just put an arrow next to thus they weave it together, and I drew a line down all the way to verse 7, if you can, in your Bible. And he says, but as for me, I will look to the Lord. And I like that contrast that Micah is drawing here. Here you have essentially unity in wickedness. All these skilled individuals who are using their skills and capabilities to rebel against God and commit sin against God, iniquity, and so forth. You come down to the bottom, this goes back to what you were talking about as far as just the desire. Micah the prophet he switches the first person here, and it's just, I've committed to following the God, following the Lord. So though the world decay, the foundation is essentially in trusting God, and that's kind of the point you were making earlier about just trying it. And we see through the eyes of history and being able to read about what happened to Israel and Judah as a result of this wickedness, this talent, this desire, this partnership in wickedness failed everybody. And it was the ones who looked to God, who stood on that trust that God is faithful, who survived all of it. You look at Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah during the Babylonian captivity. Daniel's a perfect example. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as well. But the book of Daniel, just in the face of adversity, when empires are rising and falling, what's the one constant throughout the book of Daniel? It's the prophet Daniel. Why? Because he remained faithful to God the entire time.
Yes. Yes. I have underlined in my Bible prince, judge, and great man. And then under that, weave it together. Just to kind of make it jump out to me that the prince, the judge, and the great man are weaving this together. Now, your prince, you think of as, this is your leader, this is your chosen leaders, for
Right.
us, for them it was the bloodline. Then also you have the judge. This is the person who is supposed to be upholding justice. This is the person who makes the determinations on what's good and what's right. And then you have the great man. And you think these are the people who have power and control, not because they're a king or because they're a judge, but just they have the wealth. They have the resources. And they're weaving it together for evil. And in my Bible, I just wrote that it feels pretty current. This is something that just because it was written so long ago in the Old Testament at a time, this idea is always going to feel current to us because this is what the world will always give you.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how great you plan something, how beautiful you believe democracy and voting and all of that is. Bad people can ruin anything. And if you aren't looking at God as your leader, it goes back to, again, like he's told Samuel, when you reject God as your leader, he tells you what you're going to get. Right. And you just cannot put your faith in men, especially when those men have power and influence. And power and influence of a prince, of a judge, and of a great man are great. And when they operate together for evil, it affects everybody. But something we have to remember that, and I would like to give a shout out to my friend Luke Guthrie, who preaches at Russellville, Arkansas. He, in a sermon one time, said that if we want better leaders, then we need better followers. So as in your church, if you want better elders, be better servants to your elders and help them be better leaders. If you want better leaders, in your country, we have to be better followers so that we can be the kind of people who keep bad leaders out and good leaders in. We forget that it's up to us. We forget that it's on us. A church will struggle because they say, well, we got this preacher and maybe he came in and he offended some people. And so you blame the preacher. Or we had this elder who made a decision and it offended some people and it caused a problem. So, well, okay, but the people are the church. And these elders are shepherding. How much of it is the responsibility of the people? Or are you just pushing it off on, we just need a scapegoat, someone to blame it on? It's saying that all these people are weaving it together for evil, but if you will not tolerate this kind of stuff from your position, and if you will do that as a group, you won't have these kinds of leaders. You won't have these kinds of great men that are causing these kinds of problems. So it kind of goes back to us. We can't complain about just the leaders and the great men. It's on all of us together. And again, if there would have just been a few people who were standing up for righteousness, this wouldn't be so terrible. But unfortunately, everybody just says, it is what it is. And it's that is what it is mentality that has, probably even people who would do the right thing not doing the right thing.
You're right. Complacency definitely is a detriment. That's a great point. In fact, and that's why the minor prophets like Micah are so relevant. Micah here, in essentially in the book of Micah, is showing us how to identify a decaying society. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it begins with us as individuals first, and then we affect the change when we change ourselves. So, Geoff, thank you so much for coming on, man. Yeah. I appreciate it. Enjoyed that. To those who are watching, thank you so much for your support. And until next time, keep studying.
Mark in your Bibles, underline that.